Hello, and welcome back to the Gist-ory channel. It's good to have you here. My name's Dave. I'm not a historian, I'm not an academic, but have I got some stories for you? Gist-ory is all about the story. We're here for the love of a good tale, and we might not get the details right all the time. We might miss a nuance or two, might get us facts muddled up, but one thing we can give you is the gist of it all. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, settle in and let's get back to some gistory. We've been talking about the story of Britain, and this is episode 3. And we are going to be talking about the age of the Vikings in Britain. We're going to be going through it all. We're going to be going through the Vikings attacking at Lindisfarne, King Alfred the Great Heathen Army. We're going to be going through every single bit of it, and we're going to be going through to the Danelaw. We're also going to be looking at what happened after Alfred the Great. So when Aethelstan declared himself King of England, possibly the first time that there has ever been a united King of England. Then we'll talk about King Canute, who was King of Denmark, Norway, and England, all leading up to the fateful events that would happen in 1066. There's a lot to get through. The Vikings is such a massive, such an influential time in Britain's story. So let's crack on with it, with the age of the Vikings. So we left our last episode on a cliffhanger. The year is 793, and we are at the Abbey at Lindisfarne, which is an island just off the coast of Northumbria in northern England. There are 3 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the major kingdoms of the day. It's Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the middle of England, and in the south of England, there is Wessex. Those 3 kingdoms were about to have something happen that would change the face and the fate of England forever. So when the monks are looking out over the North Sea, they can see these dragon-head longships heading towards them, and they don't realise that these are the heathens, these are the pagans, these are the scourge of England, these are the Vikings, and they have no idea what's coming. Because when the Vikings land at Lindisfarne, they massacre everybody there, steal everything. They're pagans. They have no respect for the Christian God. They think the monks are weak because they haven't defended themselves. They have no respect or any pity for anybody. It's just a complete pillage, raid, massacre, robbery of every single thing that's not pinned down. Anglo-Saxon England at this time is really wealthy. With the Sutton Hoo discovery that we discussed last episode, we realised how rich the Anglo-Saxon kingdom was. It has treasures from all over the known world. It has really intricate metalwork designs. It has precious metals there. It has so much money. And the Vikings just take all of it, especially where most of the wealth is kept in the monasteries. And this attack at Lindisfarne is just a taster of what's to come. It sends shockwaves all the way through Anglo-Saxon England. But there is a part of me that does think we spent the last episode discussing how the Anglo-Saxons came over from Germany and Denmark and practically did the same thing to the Britons who were living here. They came over, they raided, they stayed, they removed their way of life, and now it's like the Anglo-Saxons are getting attacked by a bigger, badder bully than what they were. So I hate to say you reap what you sow, but here come the Vikings. Lindisfarne is just the beginning. I mean, but why did they come? Who were the Vikings? Well, first of all, the word Viking isn't what we call the people. Well, we do call the people that. But Viking is actually a verb. When you go a Viking, it means you go raiding. It's to go on an expedition. So they are the Vikings. They are the raiders. What they actually are are the Norsemen. They are men from the north, or they're sometimes the Danes if they're from Denmark. But they get called Vikings because what they do 24/7 is they're just a Viking, baby. They're just raiding everywhere. And all along the east coast of Britain starts to see these raids happening along all the abbeys and the monasteries and the coastal communities. And the danger about the Vikings is they've come over on these longships that are designed to go on the sea and up the rivers. So the rivers become like the highways into England. So, for example, you've got the Humber River, which is by Hull in Yorkshire, in modern day England. Now, the Vikings had raided the coastal towns and settlements and abbeys, but then they just, because the longships are so well designed, they just carry on up the Humber River and you're straight into the heart of England. And that's eventually how they get to huge cities like York through the river system. So it's a real massive crisis for the Anglo Saxons. But like I say, why did they come? The Vikings. Well, first of all, there's Viking culture. Viking culture values going raiding, going a Viking. It's shown as a sign of being a great person, a great warrior. You get huge renown for it. Back in Scandinavia, so we're talking Sweden, Norway, that sort of area. I mean, it's not exactly the most hospitable place. It's not the most farmable place. Um, so England appears to be ripe for anyone wanting to conquer new lands, and it's all separated and wealthy. It's separated into kingdoms, and it's independently wealthy. It's just absolutely ripe for the taking. And look, the Vikings didn't just choose England. I mean, as we go on in our story, we'll find out that the Vikings raided northern France to create, the Norsemen created eventually Normandy, which will come into play very shortly in our next episode. But they also went all the way around Europe and attacked places in northern Africa and Sicily. There's a huge Norsemen presence in Sicily around the time of when the medieval times come around. They even got as far as Baghdad in Iraq. They used the river systems to go all the way through Russia and get to the seas down there. They even appear in like the Eastern Roman Empire that survives longer than the Western Roman Empire. They end up in Constantinople, and there's reports of Vikings being the bodyguards for like the Eastern Roman emperors. What? That's crazy. And there is it's a disputed claim, I think, but they sailed all the way over via the Greenland area to America and Newfoundland, and they were the first ones to actually have a presence there or explore those shores. The Vikings were, I mean, on the surface of it, you've got a violent, pillaging, raiding community, but also God, the ambition of those people that, and when you look into the societies, they were themselves. I mean, a bit like how we perceived the Anglo Saxons before the Sutton Hoo discovery. You think that they're just a barbaric, ruthless, violent people, but they've got real intricate ways of decoration, of shaping metals, of artwork, of architecture that shows you a real rich society, and it eventually becomes to blend with the Anglo-Saxon society once they start establishing themselves in England. So let's look more into that, shall we? I mean, we've got the Vikings starting their raids in northern England, and as the years go on, this becomes more and more frequent as the Vikings bring home stories, or sagas as they called them, which were huge tales they loved to tell over generations that got embellished and exaggerated with mythical elements. But essentially, they were passed down stories of great raids and great plunder and great targets for raids. And England becomes more and more attractive because it's divided, it's not ready for them, and it's just all there for the taking. And this is where we get a figure emerge in Norse mythology and sagas called Ragnar Lothbrok. Now, Ragnar, Lothbrok, is a semi-mythical figure. It's possible a figure like that did exist, but maybe a bit like other legendary figures like King Arthur, like Robin Hood. He might be a collection of several Viking warriors or great leaders, war leaders, molded into one, because the some of the accounts of Ragnar Lothbrok's absolutely legendary and crazy. So he's meant to be descended from Odin. He's a slayer of monsters. He raids England and France. He's meant to be the Viking who sacked Paris in 845 AD and demanded a massive ransom for it back. And it seems to be a blending of fact and folklore and cultural memory. But the Vikings have really revered him. But crucially, part of his story involves being imprisoned after a raid in Northumbria by the king of that time, the king of Northumbria, called Aella. And supposedly he was placed into a pit of snakes and executed. But as he died, he uttered a prophecy that his sons would avenge him. Now that's very foreboding, because what we get in 865, so we're what, about 70 years after the attack on Lindisfarne, and gradually the raids have been increasing. If there was a Ragnar Lothbrok, sorry, which means hairy breeches, by the way, so we can have a guess at what his trousers look like. In 865, there is a full invasion that lands in East Anglia, which is the eastern sort of hip of England, midway down, by what's called the Great Heathen Army. Now, they're called heathens because they aren't followers of the Christian faith. So the Anglo Saxons call them the Great Heathen Army, which is a massive coalition of Norsemen from Sweden, Norway, and Danes from Denmark. And they are said to be led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, and that's called Halfdan Ragnarsson and Ivar the Boneless. What a cool name that is, by the way. Also, there's meant to be a son of Ragnar Lothbrok leading this huge army called Ubba, and they've also got a leader there called Guthrum, who will become very important later in the story. So, Halfdan Ragnarsson and Ivar the Boneless. By the way, Ivar the Boneless, they don't know why he was called that, even though it sounds really cool. There are some theories as to maybe he had brittle bone disease. Maybe when he was born or something. Maybe he was slightly. He had something wrong with his skeletal structure. But there's also a theory that he he wasn't exactly the most virile of men, and maybe had a problem maintaining certain things downstairs. I don't know whether that's just a slur on his character, but that is definitely a theory that's been put forward. I just think it's a cool sounding name. So this great army, we don't know, by the way, whether they were the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, who's this legendary figure, or whether they just wanted to attach themselves to the huge legend. But this huge heathen army is a full-scale invasion. It's not a raid anymore. They are coming, and they are coming to stay. So it does tie into the Ragnar myth. The Great Heathen Army lands in 865 in East Anglia, and they attack Northumbria. The capital of Northumbria, or the major city in Northumbria, is the city of York, which is now a major city in Yorkshire in the modern day. But it becomes the centre of the Viking occupation during this time. And in 866, Northumbria falls, In 867, the kingdom of Mercia is crippled. The Vikings attack that, defeat it, and install puppet rulers who are basically under their thrall. And in 869, East Anglia falls when King Edmund is killed. Ivar the Boneless demands tribute from him. He refuses, and they take over and destroy East Anglia. So they are not messing about. The only kingdom, the last kingdom, if you're a fan of very popular TV series and book series by Bernard Cornwell and Uhtred, the last kingdom remaining of the Anglo-Saxons is Wessex. They are the ones who are holding the line against the Vikings. And not only that, 869 East Anglia falls. In 870, so the next year, there is another further invasion where they attack in the winter. So that's unheard of, by the way. Usually these raids you'd at least expect them to happen in the summer, not when you've got all your food stores inside and you're wanting to batten down the hatches and just survive through the winter, because there's no guarantee that anybody's going to survive the winter in these days. You've just got to make sure your family and you've got enough food and everything can hold out. The Vikings attack in the winter, and they attack further south this time. They're moving on towards Wessex. They attack southeast England, and they fortify Reading. And Wessex is on the brink of collapse. It looks like the apocalypse has happened. It looks like the Anglo-Saxons are going to get wiped out, just like they had done. Quite poetic. I suppose it's poetic justice. It was like what happened to the Britons. But like the Britons, they are going to need a hero to step into the frame. Who is going to save Wessex in its hour of need? The Great Heathen Army has taken over the north of England, the middle of England, and bearing down on Wessex. And that is where we will end our first part. The Vikings are here. Wessex stands on the brink. It's time for Alfred to take the stage. See you after the break. Welcome back to the Gist-ory channel. We are continuing with the age of the Vikings, and the Viking invasion of Britain is on. The Great Heathen Army has taken over the middle and north of England, and there has been an attack on the southeast of England in a great winter attack, which is unheard of. The Vikings have fortified Reading. They are bearing down on Wessex. And this is where we introduce Alfred, who would become known as Alfred the Great. He is an unlikely choice to be the king of Wessex. He is the son of Ethelwulf. By the way, the amount of people who are called Ethel something in this period is absolutely staggering, so try and bear with me. So the king of Wessex, Alfred's father, is Ethelwulf, and he has an eldest son called Ethelred I. Alfred is the younger brother. When the Vikings are moving towards Wessex, Alfred isn't the king, his brother is. But Ethelred dies, and Alfred becomes the king when it is all happening and it's all against him. Now, Alfred has his capital in Winchester, and before London became the capital of England, Winchester was considered the capital of Wessex and was for some years considered the capital of England. However, London would eventually become the capital because it outgrows Wessex and Winchester, and Westminster becomes the centre of government because it's in such an ideal place is London for trade, because it's on a river, it's defensible because it's on a river, it's in a perfect location, and it just becomes a better strategic place to hold a government, and eventually becomes the capital. And eventually, it's really the Normans, I think, that established London as the main capital. But it starts to turn into it later in the story of Alfred and his descendants. But now, for now, Alfred needs to get his act together. Otherwise, we're not going to need a capital because we're not going to have an England anymore. So what does Alfred do? After losing a few skirmishes with the Vikings, he's actually trapped in between two Viking armies, and they're bearing down on him. One of the war leaders, called Guthrum, is leading this assault, and he's able to escape. Is Alfred narrowly, and he has to go on the run into the marshes of Athelney, which is Somerset. This is in 878, which is going to be a crucial year for not only Alfred, but for England as a whole. So he hides out in the marshes and reorganizes a military attack from there. So he's having to hide from the Vikings who are occupying the area. He has to do guerrilla war tactics. Guerrilla warfare, we discussed in the first episode, it means little war in Spanish. It just means you do little attacks on people and you melt away. You don't have a big battle. It's hit and run tactics. And he's just trying to build up a force to contend with the Vikings to get back a foothold for the Saxons, who were absolutely on the ropes, going down for the knockout. And there is a famous story at this time that he's having to put himself in the hands of all these peasants, and he has to hide out in villages. And there is an enduring story that he's making all these battle plans with the army that he's trying to build in secret, trying to make a decision as to how he's going to hit back at the Vikings. And one of the peasants, women, asks him to look after her cakes that she's been baking while he's using her house. And he gets that distracted with making plans that he lets them burn. And she comes back and bollocks him in front of everybody. And he sits there and takes it. And because she's bollocked who would be the king for burning her cakes, and he takes it, it's shown as a sign of his humility. It's like he'll accept it when he's wrong. He was given a responsibility. He made a mistake, and I suppose it would have been a period of light relief just to see the king getting a rollicking off somebody for burning the cakes. But eventually, slowly, through struggle, through about 6 months of building this army in secret and doing hiding out in the marshes, little attacks and running away, Alfred manages to build up enough support, enough forces, enough allies among the remaining Saxons to meet the Vikings in a battle. It's called the Battle of Edington, and he faces the army of Guthrum, who had been leading the main attack in the south of England. And there isn't a great deal known about this battle, but it appears that the forces were quite equal, and the Saxons have been victorious against the Vikings. Guthrum is defeated by Alfred, which is a good job, because I think if Guthrum ended up winning this, I think it'd have been the last flickers of resistance would have gone if Alfred had been defeated. But he doesn't. He beats Guthrum. And as a condition of allowing Guthrum to live, the agreement is called the Treaty of Wedmore. And there are several things that happen in this, but one of the main things is Guthrum is to be baptized into the Christian faith. Religion is taken very seriously in this period of time. And remember that Guthrum is a Viking, he's a Norseman, he's a pagan in the eyes of the Anglo-Saxons. But when he gets converted, and he becomes a Christian, which is a sign of his submission, and it's a sign of his acceptance that the Saxons have defeated him. But what it also leads to is an establishment of the Danelaw. So it's an agreement. This victory must have been so significant that the Viking attack against Wessex is stopped, and it's agreed that the Vikings will retain what they've already taken over, which, by the way, is most of the north of England. So it's most of the Kingdom of Mercia. It's definitely the centre of it's in the city of York, and it's Northumbria as well. Wessex in the south of England is the only Saxon kingdom that remains. But the Danelaw, remember the Norsemen were sometimes called the Danes interchangeably, but they're mainly the Vikings who came from Denmark, but they were known as the Danes as a collective. The north of England that the Vikings control is called the Danelaw. So that is effectively run by Scandinavian overlords. It's part of the Norse Empire. It's ruled by the Vikings, and it's got Viking law, Viking traditions, Viking systems. What it does allow is Wessex gets to get back on its feet again. Alfred is able to reclaim all of the lands that had been taken from him by the Vikings in those huge invasions by the heathen army. And he manages to retake key towns, like he retakes London in 886. He does all sorts of legal and educational reforms. He reforms the navy. He's thinking, well, these Viking longships are absolutely doing us here. We need some sort of protection from it. He reforms the navy so that we actually have the beginnings of an English fleet which could fend off the Vikings before they get here. He starts a system of fortifying towns which he calls the Burr system, Burh. So he fortifies like towns on the coast so that they're a bit more capable of resisting any raids that might come from the Vikings, which don't entirely stop, by the way. It's a loose agreement, is the Danelaw. But he refortifies these towns, including London, which is called Londonburg in these days, and it's built on the old Roman town of Londinium, and that's just growing and growing. And crucially, he allies with Mercia, what's left of Mercia. The Lord of Mercia is someone called Edward, and Alfred marries his oldest child, his daughter Ethelfled, to Edward, and so he's basically secured that alliance with the other Saxon kingdom that's neighbouring the Danelaw. But crucially, he names himself, after retaking London in 886, King of the Anglo-Saxons. So this is the first time he's declared himself king of a whole people, but it's really in name only. It's not yet a reality because we've got Vikings ruling half of what is England. So yes, Alfred declares himself king of the Anglo-Saxons. He's got overlordship of the Saxons who are living within his controlled lands, including Mercia. He's overlord of Mercia, but he's not the king of a united England. That will come later. So in the early 900s, there's a new wave of Viking attacks, and England must start to unite because it's not all just sweetness and lights now that the Danelaw has been established. The Vikings are the Vikings. They're still going to raid. They're still going to pillage. They're a separate entity now. So the Danelaw just, have as separate warlords and leaders who'll maybe attack into Wessex or Mercia. And then you've got other raiders who are coming from Denmark and Norway and Sweden anyway. So it must have been absolutely horrendous living in this period as a Saxon because it's a never ending nightmare. You can't relax. So that is Alfred's great achievement, really, is rebuilding Wessex and establishing a resistance when it seems like resistance was absolutely a non-starter. But the making of England proper comes after Alfred's death. So he's succeeded by Edward the Elder, who is his son, and he's greatly assisted, or the making of England is greatly assisted by Ethelfled, who is his daughter. Now, obviously, if things were right and correct in the world, she should have succeeded Alfred. But in this day and age, it's a male line of succession that takes precedence. So it is his eldest son, Edward, who takes over and not Ethelfled. So during the period of Edward the Elder, there are constant fights with the Vikings, with the Danelaw. But what overshadows Edward somewhat is Ethelfled, who, as we recall, was married to the Lord of Mercia, to Ethelred of Mercia. Now, when he dies, Ethelfled becomes the Lady of the Mercians, and she leads attacks against the Vikings. Honestly, until I started looking into this, I couldn't believe I hadn't heard of Ethelfled, because, like I mentioned in the last episode, in history, sometimes women don't get the spotlight they deserve. And I think this is one of those occasions because Ethelfled is an absolute beast when it comes to leading the Saxons and the English against the Vikings. So she continues expanding with her brother, who's Edward the Elder. She expands the network of fortified towns that Alfred was doing. And in 917, she recaptures Derby, which is the first of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw that falls to the English. So she's the first person to actually start clawing stuff back from the Vikings. In 918 AD, Leicester surrendered to her without a fight, and the Viking leaders in York offered their surrender to her. They were all ready to sort of lay down their arms, but she died before she could take advantage of it. It was in 1918, in 918. She died through an unknown cause. She was about 47, maybe 48 years old, and it's not thought to be in suspicious circumstances, which would be usual for the time. But she didn't manage to claim the victory. York was the main centre of the Viking Danelaw, and she didn't live to see that victory. But what an achievement from Ethelfled, brother Edward the Elder, king of the Anglo-Saxons. When Ethelfled dies, her daughter takes over as the Lady of Mercia just for a short period of time, and Edward quickly takes control of Mercia directly, expanding his influence. So by the end of 918, Edward the Elder ruled Wessex, Mercia, and East Anglia. It was only Northumbria that remained outside his authority that was in the Danelaw. And then it submitted to him in 920 AD. He forced a submission of Northumbria, and his authority extended up to the Humber River and beyond it. So he controlled most of England by the time he died. In 924, he dies, and Aethelstan, Alfred the Great's grandson, becomes accepted as king by the Mercians and soon after by Wessex. And it's Aethelstan who goes on to, when he's king, to take York in 927, and then he defeats a huge coalition that are against him. 3 nations go against him. Strathclyde, which was a separate kingdom, it ran on the west coast of the north of England. Scotland and Ireland, they all combined against him. And there was a huge battle at a place called Brunanburh in 937, which was one of the bloodiest battles that was recorded to date. It's recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which, by the way, was set up by Alfred the Great. It was like a historic chronicle. So it was a record of battles and kings and events that happened. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to start creating a history of the Anglo-Saxon people to preserve it, because obviously he was under the cosh from the Vikings massively. And how he did that, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, is he'd send it out to monasteries all over England and say, right, you start recording your history over there, and you in that area, you do your history. And so they could compile it together as a huge chronicle. So what we've got from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that Alfred the Great started are records done independently of each other, but they tell the story of Alfred the Great's reign and his successors. And it's really interesting for historians to look at them, because they've all got their own like little views on events. They don't like some people, they like some people, so they'll praise people here. They'll absolutely rinse them in the next breath and what have you. And it's all varied accounts and varied perspectives, but it's a narrative of the time. And so we get a record of Aethelstan after this battle that's recorded as what's called a Pyrrhic victory. Now, essentially, that means it was a battle that you won, but it was that costly to you. Was it even worth winning? So, like, most of your army gets wiped out in the winning it. But Pyrrhic victory or not, it allows um, Ethelstan to be declared King of all England. So that's when England gets recognised as one united country that he rules. And it's from that point that we move on to the kings, the queens of England as an independent country. It was that moment. So you can say that Alfred the Great was declared king of the Anglo-Saxons, but it's Ethelstan who is the first true king of England, because once he's fought off that coalition at Brunanburh, that means that there's no real contenders against him, except for the Vikings, who do not stop coming. And that's what we're going to explore in part three, when the Viking raids continue and the successors of Alfred the Great, the kings of England, have to secure against the threats that keep coming, leading us all up to a certain year called 1066, the most radical change England's ever going to go through, and it all will happen in 1 year. But the road to 1066 starts in part three. We'll see you there. Hello and welcome back to Gist-ory with me, Dave, where you might not get the whole story, but you'll definitely get the gist. So, we have a king of all England. We have Ethelstan, who is the grandson of Alfred the Great. This is in the year 924 that he becomes the king, and it's after his victory at Brunanburh, which we believe was fought down near the Wirral, near Liverpool on the west coast of England in 937 AD. So we have a succession of kings, queens, rulers of all England, and we still have those flipping Vikings. They just won't stop. The Vikings are just relentless. And over the years, we have a succession of Ethelstans, Ethelfleds, Edwards, Egbert. I've made half of them up, but they all start with E. They all get confusing. And if we're just giving you the gist of it, it was a back and forth with the Vikings. The Vikings had come, they still had the appetite for raiding, for pillaging. Then there'd be an agreement and they'd stop and then they'd come back again. And it was just a relentless, relentless time. We go through the years from Ethelstan through his line of descendants, and we end up with the king that started the road to what would happen in 1066, which we'll be exploring in our next episode. But this is Ethelred II, who is called Ethelred the Unready. And this is in 978 AD when he comes to the throne. And Ethelred is called the Unready because it means he's the unread. It's not that he's not ready for something, it means literally he isn't very well read or isn't very well advised. He's known as being poorly advised on what to do. So this king makes some very, very poor decisions. And he's massively struggling with the Vikings. They are intensifying their raids and they are not letting up. And he has got into the practice of regularly paying them off. So they'll basically turn up on the shore, say, and it's like a robbery. It's like, give us all of your cash, all of your jewels, all of your valuables, or we're going to absolutely set your country to the torch. And he would constantly pay them off, which, if you've ever had to deal with someone threatening you, the worst thing you can do is give in to them. Because if you give up the first time, they're just going to keep coming back. All right, so all we need to do is ball up our fist and threaten to hit him. And then he'll be like, oh no, here you go, here's all my money. Well, of course they're going to keep coming back. And it became known as the Danegeld. So it was the gold that he would give the Danes to go away. Please don't hurt me. Please don't hurt me. So he'd keep paying the Dane geld, and they'd keep coming back, threatening to. They'd spend it all, and then they'd come back and threaten him again, and he'd have to. He'd end up paying out again. And in this time in England's history, the Vikings are starting to integrate with the rest of English society. So there's some Vikings who are living in English settlements, there's some intermarriage. Obviously, we've had the Danelaw up in the north. So we've got people of Viking descent in there. And it's starting to really bother Ethelred that he's powerless to stop them. So this is probably one of those bad decisions of this unready king. He decides he's going to get some backup against the Norsemen, and he's going to get his own back on them and stamp his authority down. So he has a very significant marriage in 1002 AD. So we've passed the first millennium. So it's the year 1002, and he marries Emma of Normandy. Now, Normandy is an area at the top part of France that's called Normandy because the Norsemen had taken control of that. In the year 911 AD, a great Viking raider called Rollo, Rollo, had sort of extorted the king of the Franks, who was king of that area of what we would become known as France because of the Franks. And he'd demanded and been gifted land in the top part of France to rule over, which he did. So Rollo became the leader of and the overlord of that area of France, which became Normandy. And then so this was a Viking who'd settled um, this part of France, and over the years established themselves into more of a self-governing duchy, a really, really powerful duchy. And the descendants of Rollo include Emma of Normandy, who's just got married to Ethelred the Unready, but it also includes someone called William the Conqueror, who will be showing up very shortly, particularly in the next episode. But Ethelred has married himself to Emma of Normandy. He feels that he's got enough backup from these hard nuts across the channel that he's going to fight back against the Vikings. And he thinks that the best way to do that is by ordering a massacre of any Vikings in England. And it's called the St. Brice's Day Massacre. It happened in November in the year 1002. So the same year he's married Emma of Normandy. And he orders that all the Danish men who are in England are to be killed. And archaeologists have found Scandinavian mass graves that suggest this actually did happen. It appears to have been targeted, so it's men of fighting age. And it was probably due to all the escalating pressure he was under, the fears that people were always in his ear saying, you know that these Danes are never going to stop, you know. You know that they're eventually going to kill you. They're eventually going to want your whole kingdom. So it's probably a bit of humiliation and insecurity. But this massacre does not go unanswered. It's not like the Danes, the Norsemen, are just going to let this go, particularly when it's reported in the Anglo Saxon Chronicle that there was a certain casualty amongst one of these attacks on what were just meant to be men of fighting age. There is a female casualty in there called Gunhilda, who was the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, who just happens to be King of Denmark. They've killed the King of Denmark's sister in this massacre against the Norsemen. So, what do you think his reaction's going to be? He goes absolutely crazy with rage and invades England in a huge revenge attack, and he throws everything he's got at it, and the full scale Viking invasion to take over the entire country is launched. and he's constantly battering England over a series of years, and he eventually takes the throne in 1013. Ethelred flees into exile, and we have a Viking king. So the king of Denmark is now the king of England, and it's Svein Forkbeard. But he is not king for long. He dies suddenly. After he died, he's only ruling from 1013 to 1014, and he's dead. And as soon as he's dead, guess who shows up again? Ethelred. He sneaks back into the picture, gets on throne, reinstalls himself as the king, but that doesn't last long because his reign collapses because there's massive pressure coming now because there's a Viking counterattack against England by another king, the next king of Denmark, who happens to also be the king of Norway, who's called King Canute. It's spelled Cnut, and he becomes known as Canute the Great. Ethelred ends up dying, and in 1016, so he's only alive for another couple of years after he nicks the throne back off Sweyn Forkbeard. So Ethelred's son, Edmund II, becomes the English king in 1016, and he desperately tries to fight King Canute off. He wins several battles, manages just about to force a stalemate, and King Canute, agrees with him that him and Edmund are going to divide the kingdom between them, bearing in mind that the Saxons, the English, had pretty much kicked the Vikings out and had secured the whole land. Now Canute's managed to say, right, well, we're going to have to divide it, otherwise this war ain't stopping. Edmund agrees to that, but then he dies. He dies suddenly. And Canute the Great, from 1016, Edmund's only been king for a year. He dies suddenly. Canute the Great becomes king of not only Denmark, not only Norway, but he's king of England and all. So he's king of three countries and king for about 20 years. He's king until 1035. So he starts at 1016. He's king until 1035. We've got a Viking king, and it's become known as the North Sea Empire. But surprisingly, he's reportedly a effective and respected king. He ends up marrying Emma of Normandy, who was Ethelred the Unready's widow. Emma of Normandy, who will end up being a big player in what's to come in 1066, is now Queen of England again, but with Canute. And this strengthens Normandy's ties to the English royal house because she's the sister of the Duke of Normandy. Now, when Canute ends up dying in 1035, his son takes over, who's called Harefoot. He's called Harold the First, and he's called Harefoot. And it's a really messy succession. There's a few people now are thinking, well, who's going to be the king? Are we going to have Canute's descendants? Are we going to have Ethelred's descendants? Or what's going to happen here? So Harold just about manages to succeed because he's got a half brother called Harthacnut, who's also one of Canute the Great's sons, who's an absolute arsehole, it seems. But Harold the First has a very shaky reign from 1035 to 1040. Then Harthacnut, his brother, takes over from 1040 to 1042. He's absolutely horrible. He puts a brutal tax system in. He's a really harsh ruler, but he dies suddenly at a wedding feast, which I don't think was as dramatic as the Red Wedding on Game of Thrones. But he's dead. And the person who ends up taking over from him, because he doesn't have a successor, is the son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy. It is Edward the Confessor. He becomes known as Edward the Confessor because he's very pious. He builds Westminster Abbey. He restores the House of Wessex. And he becomes the king. However, there was a slight issue with Edward the Confessor becoming the king. I think Emma of Normandy, who was Canute's widow, by the way, had a hand in this because there was an agreement made with Arthur Canute and King Magnus of Norway. Now, stick with me with this because this is quite important for the next episode. So, Arthur Canute, who was the previous king, who was horrible, had made an agreement with Magnus, the King of Norway, that he would rule over England, Magnus would rule over Norway, but whoever died first to get the whole lot. So, when Arthur Canute dies, Magnus of Norway, the King of Norway, thinks, right, well, my agreement with the King of England was once he dies, I get the job lot. But it appears that Edward the Confessor gets to be the king, and the King of Norway has lost out. This would later be what Harald Hardrada, who becomes the next king of Norway, uses as his claim when he attacks in 1066, but that's for next episode. At the moment, we have Edward the Confessor on the throne, which is setting the scene. He becomes king in 1042, all the way up to 1066 when he dies. Now, Edward the Confessor, will go into this more in the next episode, but the stage is set for trouble if he doesn't produce an heir to the throne or if he doesn't name an heir clearly enough, which is what he ends up doing. He plays favourites, he tells one person one thing, another somewhat different, and during King Canute's reign, King Canute had a very capable battle commander who he made the Earl of Wessex, called Godwin, who has maintained his station as the Earl of Wessex, so the leader of Wessex, and he'd become the most powerful noble in the land underneath the king, Edward the Confessor. And the House of Godwin, as it will become known as, is in a prime position to become very political. And Godwin marries his daughter to Edward the Confessor. So his daughter Edith, they all start with bloody E's to these names, but Edith marries Edward the Confessor. So the House of Godwin is now in a right position to be closest to the king, to be linked to the king. Across the English Channel, there is a certain noble called William, whose great aunt, Emma of Normandy, is the mother of the king. We'll see how that plays out. But we also have a great fearsome king in Norway called Harald Hardrada, who believes he has a claim on England. And so, with that, that might not be the whole story, but it's the gist of it. Thank you for listening to this story of the Viking Age of England. We had a lot to get through. There was a lot that happened, but we explored the first Viking invasion, then Alfred the Great, then his defense against the Vikings. Then we moved on to the great exploits of his children, particularly Ethelfled, then Edward the Elder, then Ethelstan, his grandson, who became the first king of all England. And then we've gone through the years of Alfred's descendants, and the kings of England have come up against King Canute. Canute has made way eventually through his sons for Edward the Confessor, and Edward the Confessor lacks an heir, and it's going to be a huge problem if he's not clear on who his successor is when we reach up to the crucial year of 1066. But that will be next week. So thank you so much for listening. As I've mentioned before, I'm not a historian, I'm not an academic. I do this for the love of history, for the love of the stories. If you've enjoyed this podcast, this episode, please give us a like. Please subscribe to the Gist-ory podcast for more content. I really, really appreciate you listening. This is a passion project of mine. Let me know if you've got anything to talk about in the comments, if you've got any suggestions, if you want to talk about any of the events that we've discussed. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll try and get back to you. But I'm afraid that's it for this episode. We've got all the time. We've used all the time we have, and I'm afraid this episode is now history. I'll see you next time for 1066, where we continue our story of Britain. Until then, take care of yourself. See you next time. Ta-ra!